Hello and welcome to another adventure here on my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about The Cruel Prince. Now I am going to try to make this as spoiler free as possible, however anything that's on the back of the book or in the first couple chapters is going to be on the table, but after that I will talk in more vague terms about anything plot related, just so you can still read this book if you're interested after this video and not have too much spoiled. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in, because this is the book that I have been recommended the absolute most on TikTok. Like every freaking book talk video I see mentions this book in some way. That's a little bit of a hyperbole, but if you asked me what is the #1 book on TikTok, The Cruel Prince would be my guess, because I have just seen so much content about it. So when I finally felt like I was in the mood to read it, I was like, okay, I have to do it, because when this many people like a book, it's usually pretty darn, a lot of people like 50 Shades of Grey. I mean, do they? Okay, when this many book nerds like a book, it's usually pretty dang good. And I have to say, yeah, TikTok was right in this case with this book, because I have been absolutely obsessed with this book since I picked it up. Since that very first chapter, I've been listening to the audiobook version and I am already on the 3rd book, and it's been like a week. And it usually takes me a decent amount of time to get through an audiobook, just because I'll listen to it while I'm driving, I'll listen to it while I'm doing chores, but it's not really high up on my priorities. It's just, if I want to listen to something instead of listening to music, I'll do that. That's why I tend to save up Audible credits a lot, because it just takes me a while to get through a book. So going through an entire series in a week, that's a lot for me. I have done almost nothing else but listen to this book in every minute of free time that I have had. My YouTube watch later list is ridiculously long because I haven't watched anything this whole week, because I have just been so in love with this book series. I am on the 3rd book. I haven't finished the 3rd book. I'm about halfway through, and my intention was to make this video just after finishing the 1st book, but I could not wait. I could not wait to keep going in the series. I also listened to the novella from her sister's point of view. Like, this book series has just captured me, and I'm so glad, because I've been having such a fun time. It's been a while since a book has really captured me like this. So if you have never heard of The Cruel Prince, if you know nothing about it, 1, how are you this far on the internet to find my channel? But 2, it is a very popular enemies to lovers fantasy series. And before reading this book, pretty much all I knew about this book was that it was enemies to lovers and had something to do with fae. It was a fairy world that this book took place in. This whole book really was not what I was expecting with what I knew of it from TikTok. So in the first chapter, or it might be the preface, we are introduced to our main character, Jude. She is hanging out with her twin sister Taryn and their older sister Vivi. Their parents are in the house. They are just chilling out on some afternoon, morning. They're just chilling out in their house together. And then someone knocks at the door. Jude opens it, and this strange man comes in and murders both of her parents in front of her. And I was like, not how I expected a romance novel to start, because when I first started reading this book, I thought it was a romance novel. And it turns out that this man who came in and murdered both her parents was her mother's first husband, who is the father of her older sister Vivi, and he is a fae. He is a red cap fae who is a general in the High King's army. And her mother was a human that originally married him and then faked her death and escaped back to the human world with her human, now second husband. And these 2 human parents are Jude and Taryn's parents, the twin sisters' parents. So the older sister is a fairy, but the younger 2 sisters are not. They are just human. So Maddox, who is the first husband and the general who has murdered these children's parents in front of them, he now believes that it is his responsibility to take the girls and care for them, even though the younger 2 are not his daughters. He sees it as a duty in that they are his wife's daughters, so they are his responsibility. So he takes all 3 of them back to Fairy, that's the name of the land, where the Fae live, and he raises them as if they were his own daughters, as if they are members of the fairy gentry, part of the court, even though the other courtiers don't really like this. The other children their age don't really like treating humans as if they are equal to them, and the other Fae very much do not treat Jude and Taryn as if they are their equals, including the titular cruel prince, Carden. He is one of their classmates, and he very much does not like these two girls. So we have skipped ahead 10 years, I believe. I think they're 16 in the book, and they were 6 when that happened, so we skipped ahead 10 years. They are attending classes here in Fairyland and have basically grown up there with this weird tension of Matic is their parents' murderer, but he's also the closest thing to a father they've had, and the other Fae children their age are treating them cruelly. And while Taryn, the twin sister, is very meek and subservient and just kind of takes it, she doesn't want to give them more reasons to mess with her. Jude, our leading lady, has pretty much decided she is done with this. She has had enough shit, and the book unfolds from there. Honestly, pretty fun. Very fun premise. Not what I was expecting at all. I wasn't thinking we were gonna start this with a double murder in front of small children. So interesting, really grabbed me right off the bat, and I was very interested to see what would happen after this. But again, not really what I was expecting from a romance novel. But the thing is, TikTok lied to me. This book is not a romance novel. In the first one, there is pretty much no romance at all, almost. And in fact, the little bit of romance that there is in this book is not even with the cruel prince. So I was very taken aback that this is not a romance novel. This is a political drama. This is straight fantasy political drama. And then later in the series, there's a little bit of romance. And politics takes the front seat. In the whole series so far, romance is kind of just a background character motivation thing, which I do enjoy. I enjoy a book like that, but I just kind of feel like instructions unclear. I don't think anyone on TikTok was trying to like actively deceive people. It's just the impression I got from this book was that there was a lot more romance than there is, but I also understand why what a lot of people like about this book is the romance, because I do really like the dynamic between Jude and our cruel prince. I do really like their dynamic as the series goes on, and I do like the romance that is there, but that is just kind of like backseat through all of this. But I am someone who loves a political drama, especially a fantasy political drama, and especially a high fantasy political drama that is still accessible. Because I'm someone who, I enjoy high fantasy movies and television, but I do find high fantasy novels to be a little tedious at times. And by high fantasy, I mean like Lord of the Rings. Like, we are in a completely separate world. We are not in the human world. We're not in familiar things to us. And you could argue that The Cruel Prince isn't true high fantasy because it does spend a little time in our known human world. But considering the majority of the book is spent in this world separate from ours with rules and customs and magic that is very different from like what we have, I would categorize this as high fantasy rather than something like the Mortal Instrument series, who has fantasy elements, but you're mostly spending time in the world we're familiar with. It's just kind of blending fantasy elements with that. So these books I would categorize as more high fantasy, but it's a very approachable high fantasy that doesn't have the tediousness to it that I personally just don't love about the genre, because I am just someone who, I want to see what's going on. I want things to happen. I want the characters to be interacting. I don't want to hear a lot of exposition about how things look. I don't want a lot of descriptions about the land and the rooms, and like, give me enough that I can kind of start to picture it, but just allow me to fill in the blanks in my mind and move on from there. And while I understand why fantasy as a genre has to do a lot of descriptive works, that's just not what I love to read. So I feel like The Cruel Prince really gets it right with the amount of description in the set dressing, in the costuming, in what's going on in the world physically, while it still remains very dedicated to the characters, their actions, the plot, rather than just really trying to fill out this fantasy world and try to make me feel like I'm there. But the thing is, the fact that the character feels like she's actually there and interacting with the world gives me that same sense without dragging down the story with a bunch of description. There is a lot of exposition, especially in the first book, about just how things work. And there is a bit of the telling instead of showing, but honestly, when you're working with a different world from our own, sometimes you just have to tell your reader, hey, here's how it works, here's what's going on, let's keep it moving, to not get that bogged down feeling. So I personally really like that writing choice, and I think if you are also someone who enjoys high fantasy in theory but has a hard time reading it, this might be a good book series for you. But if you are like a political drama person, then this is definitely a good series for you because it is very Game of Thrones-esque in the most non-Game of Thrones way possible. Like, it has a similar vibe in that the main plot is the politics and how all these characters are playing chess with each other. And it's a fantasy world, but that is where the Game of Thrones-ness ends. Wait, no. There is a lot of murder in this book, too. There is a lot of murder. Which, you know what? I kind of liked. Which, I know how that sounds, but it's a fantasy novel. I am not here to get my morality. I am here to have a good time, and the kind of callous way they treat murder in this world tells me a lot about the world without having to tell me. Like, it shows me a lot about the world without having to tell me the fact that murder is such a callous thing. It's not something that's not important, and all of the murders are important to the story, and like which of the main characters have murdered people and who hasn't is important in telling us a lot about their character. And I think the author does very interesting things with it for character motivation. And honestly, that is my biggest thing with any novel, is the characters. Can you give me a good character that I can root for, and can you fill their world with other characters that feel like real people? And what I really like about this is every single character, side character, has their own things going on. They have their own schemes. They have their own motivations separate from our main character. Because I feel like the main character, Jude, she has a little bit of main character syndrome, and like things keep happening to her, but it also seems to be because she keeps putting herself in these situations, and it makes sense that the other characters would react in turn and start the chain of dominoes that leads to the things that happen to her. So while at first I kind of felt like the world kind of seems to revolve around her a little bit, I realized that it was written well enough that they happen because the other characters' worlds revolve around them, and our main character, Jude, plays a role in all of their schemes, and she comes against their schemes, and she works with their schemes in different ways. And the thing is, I didn't realize that was done so well until I read the novella that comes after the first book. So there's like the first book, book 1.5, that's a novella, and then the second book. And the novella is the first book told from her twin sister's perspective, and what was going on with the twin sister and why she made the choices she did in that first book. And her choices in particular in the first book, I was like, I don't know what's going on here. I don't know if you're like a fully fledged character or if you're just making the decisions you need to make in order to affect Jude's story in the way the author wants it to go. But after reading from her perspective, I'm like, oh, you really were making these decisions outside of Jude. Not because of her, not because it's what the plot needed you to do, but because that is in your character and they just happen to affect Jude in this way. And I think that is genuinely the mark of a really, really good author. Because there are some authors that have this writing style, this magic that just makes their books impossible to put down. One that comes to mind right away is Stephenie Meyer. Like, those Twilight books, say what you will about them, but once you pick one up, you are in it for the whole ride. There is something just like addicting about the writing style that you have to keep going and have to see what happens. Also, The Host, Stephenie Meyer, great book. I will stand by that. And this author has that same flair, but unlike Twilight, where once you start to like take a step back and really think about it, everything just kind of starts falling apart a little bit. With these books, they have that flair, but everything is so well put together that, yeah, there are plot holes and things, like no novel is absolutely perfect, but it all just works really well and it's really well thought through. And I feel like that's why this book has been so popular, because it's one of those books that just grabs you and sucks you in and you just want to keep reading it. But when you're done, you're left with all these fun things to think about and fun puzzles, and the characters make sense and they seem like their own people, and it was just so well done. It was just so well done. Another thing I really liked about this series, and this comes way more into play in the second and third books than the first book, but there are sexy moments without them being overly sexual. Like, so far there has been no graphic sex scenes, which I'm really happy with. Like, save that stuff for the fan fiction. If I want that, I will go find a spicy fanfic on my own. Don't just like throw it in there for me, because I don't know if I'm going to be driving in my car listening to this when that pops up, sitting surrounded by people if it's in the physical book. I don't want that. I just don't want that in my novels. I understand why some people do. Take no shame in it if that is your preference, but it's just not for me. So I really liked that, especially because this is a YA novel. There really is no graphicness to those scenes, though, and I never really give this critique. In some ways, I think it could be a little more explicit, just in tell me what actually happened, because there was one point in the second book where two characters were with each other, and I thought they had just made out. I thought it was like a heavy makeout session, and it's only through later how the characters think and feel about it that I understood, no, they did more than that. They went all the way with each other, and I didn't realize that at the time, and I was like, I just wish that was a little clearer. So in between filming and editing this video, I did finish the third book, and I realized that I was wrong about being wrong. They did only make out in the second book, but the critique about it not being super clear with what happened obviously still stands, since I've gone back and forth on, no, this happened, no, this happened. So I wish what happened in that scene and their feelings about it was just a little more clear. And in the third book, there is a more explicit sex scene than there is in the first two. However, it's not terrible. It very much is like, okay, it's sexy, there's build up, it's clear what's happening here, and then skip to the next morning, skip to afterwards. So personally, that is my preference, and if there is going to be scenes like that, that's how I prefer them to be. So I still really like the level of sexuality in this book because it's not too graphic, especially, again, for a YA novel. But I also really like that about the book because I'm a substitute teacher and I end up in middle schools a lot. And sometimes the kids ask me, oh, are you reading something? Because I'll have them read and they'll be like, well, are you reading something? And I'll be like, yes. And they'll be like, what? And I'll be like, I cannot tell you, because then if you look it up, it is not appropriate for middle schoolers. So this is a book that, while it handles some adult themes, I wouldn't feel like horrible giving it to a middle schooler. It's kind of a book like Harry Potter in that adults can really enjoy it, but it is still appropriate for tweens and teens, and I don't feel weird about that. Though, one of my biggest, I guess not critiques, because I understand why it is this way, the characters are like 16, 17 in the book, and I just feel like with their actions, what they're doing, they just feel a little bit older to me. Like even 18, 19, still keeping it in that YA teenager age range, that would make more sense to me than having them be 16, 17 in the books, because I just feel like they're acting a little too mature to be the ages that they are. In fact, honestly, in my head, I am picturing them as my age. I am picturing them as early to mid 20s rather than teenagers, which I know in a way is because that's my perspective and that's my current age. And so it's a little bit of like self-insert into the text in that I feel like they're acting more my age, but I do really think that they should have been aged up just a couple of years to make everything going on just feel a little bit more realistic. And I know it's hard to ask for realism in your fantasy novel, but when it comes to ages, I just feel like the human characters, like we know how human beings age and maturity levels, and I just feel like they're a little bit too mature for how old they are. And you could totally argue that that's because of their life experiences, but I just feel like it would have benefited the book to have the characters be just a little bit older. But honestly, if that's my biggest critique in this book, like, it's a pretty darn good book. TikTok got it right. I cannot recommend these enough. I think they're fabulous. I'm trying to talk my best friend into reading them so I can geek about them with her, because I'm like, look, new obsession. I need you to come along with me. I am dragging you with me because they are so freaking good. And yes, Carden is an amazing book boyfriend. I see why everyone is so heart eyes over him, as am I now. So with that, thank you so much for watching. Let me know, have you read these books? Are you going to? I would love to geek out with you guys down in the comments, though let's try to keep it kind of spoiler free, spoiler light, so that way these comments aren't like a spoiler minefield for people who haven't read these books yet. But TikTok was definitely right, so if you haven't read these books, I do highly recommend them. And with that, again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. And I mean, I'm just gonna say it, if they ever make these into a movie, they should cast me as Jude and Taryn, because I think I would do a really good job at the role. Or roles, because they're twins and I don't have a twin, so I'd have to play both. But like, I could do it. I could do it really well.